He saved Apache woman from drowning. Now her tribe says she belongs to him by sacred law.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The land was quiet that morning. Not peaceful, just quiet. Dry wind stirred the tall grass and moved through the brittle brush along the canyon's edge. A jackrabbit darted from cover as the sound of hooves approached, but there were no other signs of life. The sky was pale and wide overhead, still holding the last chill of night. Thorn Maddox rode along the ridge trail just above the river, one hand resting lightly on the reins, the other hanging loosely at his side. His coat was worn at the cuffs, the collar sun-faded and stiff. He hadn't shaved in days. The mule-colored horse beneath him was steady, quiet, used to the silence they shared. Thorn didn't speak unless he had to. At 43, he'd lived more life than he'd wanted. A Union cavalryman once, he came home with a shattered knee and a burial flag in a satchel. His wife and daughter died of fever the winter after his return. Since then, he kept to himself, running cattle on a spread tucked between the canyon's edge and the tree line. People left him alone. He preferred it that way. That morning, he was checking the south fence line after a storm had rolled through 2 nights prior. He hadn't slept well. His knee ached more in the cold, and the storm had knocked loose half the eastern post last spring, so he didn't trust the ground this time either. As he dismounted near a bend in the trail where the fence dipped close to the river, he could already tell something was off. The post he'd replaced last fall was leaning again. Soil had given way. He crouched to check it, bracing himself on the good leg, fingers digging into the damp dirt. It was worse than he thought. The river had swelled higher than it should have. Another season or two like this, and the land would wash out altogether. He frowned, stood up slowly, one hand pressed to the small of his back. Then he heard it. A splash, not like a fish, not like driftwood. Heavy, human. His head snapped up. He scanned the water, squinting against the glare. At first, there was nothing but the current and foam. Then movement. A figure, half submerged, twisting weakly in the water. An arm reached out, then vanished again. Panic shot through him fast. No time to think. He moved. Fast. Dropped his tools. Shrugged off his coat mid-run. Limp be damned. He hit the slope hard, slid down the embankment, boots punching through the soft ground until he reached the water's edge. He didn't pause. Just dove in. The river was colder than he expected. It knocked the air out of his lungs. The current pulled at his legs. He pushed forward anyway, arms cutting through the water in strong strokes. His knee screamed, but he kept going. She surfaced once just ahead, young, face half covered in black hair, mouth open like she was trying to cry out. He got to her in 3 more strokes, grabbed her around the waist, and kicked hard to get them both back to shore. She was barely conscious. Her skin was cold, lips pale. The soaked deerskin dress she wore clung to her full figure. It was torn at the neckline, exposing the soft top of her chest where her breath came in shallow pulls. Her feet were bare. There were scratches on her arms and a bruise forming above her temple. Thorn dragged them both onto the bank, falling to his knees beside her. He pulled her upright, supported her back. She coughed, gagged up water, then went still. Her eyes opened just barely, dark brown, muddied with fear, but alert. He studied her face, young, maybe 24 at most. Apache. His pulse still hadn't slowed. His heart thumped hard in his chest, and he realized his hands were shaking. He looked down the river, expecting someone else to come. Family, a horse, a shout. Nothing, just wind and water. "Where the hell did you come from?" he muttered under his breath. She didn't answer. She couldn't. He glanced around, his mind already ticking through the next steps. He couldn't leave her here. She was too cold, barely breathing. Getting her dry was the priority. His cabin was a half-mile uphill. He had blankets, firewood, and a bed. He didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms, one beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. She was heavier than she looked, soaked and limp, her head resting against his chest, her breath feathering weakly against his collar. She didn't speak. Her eyes fluttered shut. Thorn gritted his teeth and started back up the hill. Each step sent pain through his knee. By the time he reached the trail, He was breathing hard, but he didn't stop. He carried her past his horse, who pawed the dirt anxiously, and into the trees where his small cabin sat tucked between two tall pines. The chimney was cold. He hadn't lit a fire yet today. That would change. Inside, he laid her gently on the bed and covered her with every blanket he had. He stripped off her moccasins, checked for wounds. Her ankle was twisted, but not broken. He hesitated when he reached for the blanket again. The torn dress left little to the imagination. He draped his old wool coat over her shoulders, turned away, and went to light the fire. He knelt by the hearth, striking a match, hands still wet and unsteady. The flame caught slowly. Once it took, he stood and looked back at her. She was watching him now, barely, from under heavy lids. Her lips moved, but no sound came. He stepped closer. "You're safe," he said, voice low and even. "You're all right now." She blinked once. He didn't ask who she was. Not yet. He wasn't sure she could answer. And maybe, right now, it didn't matter. He pulled a chair to the far corner of the room, sat down, and stared at the fire. His jaw was tight. He didn't know what he'd just invited into his home, but he couldn't have left her there. And now she was here, alive. And for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The fire crackled steadily by the time dawn gave way to full morning. A soft orange glow stretched across the cabin floor, brushing against the foot of the bed where she lay still, half covered by wool blankets and his old coat. Her breathing had steadied overnight, no longer shallow, but slow and deliberate. The color had returned slightly to her face. Her dark hair had dried in waves over the pillow, the ends tangled and streaked with dried mud. Thorn had not slept. He'd remained in the wooden chair across the room, boots planted firm, hands folded tight in his lap. His shirt was still damp from the river, his knees still ached, and his mind ran circles around what had happened. Who was she? Where'd she come from? Why was she alone in the river? He didn't ask her those things. Not yet, but the questions hung between them like smoke. She stirred slightly under the blankets and turned her face toward the fire. Her fingers tightened around the edge of his coat. When her eyes blinked open, they landed on him, watchful, quiet, not afraid but cautious. Thorn leaned forward slowly. "You understand me?" he asked, voice quiet but clear. A pause, then a nod. "Barely. You hurt anywhere?" Another pause. She moved her hand to her ankle, pressed lightly, winced. Thorn stood and walked over, limping slightly. He crouched at the edge of the bed, careful not to crowd her, and looked at the swelling. No break, just twisted. He wrapped her ankle gently with a clean band of cloth. She didn't pull away, but her eyes never left his face. Her dress, still damp in places, was torn in multiple spots, especially across the chest. The neckline had been ripped down one side, probably by a branch in the current. And though the coat covered her now, the softness of her cleavage had been exposed for most of the night. Thorn had seen it, yes, but he hadn't lingered. Not because he didn't notice, but because it wasn't his right to look. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He stepped back and let her rest. She kept watching him. "Name?" he asked after a long moment. She hesitated. "Sana." It came out soft, with a hint of accent. "Apache." He nodded once. "Thorn." He tapped his chest. She looked around slowly, her gaze taking in the rough wooden walls, the single-room space, the sparse furniture, a small table, a trunk, an old saddle on a hook. Her eyes stopped on the rifle hanging near the door. "Safe here," he said, following her glance. "No one's coming." It was a lie. Not because someone was coming, but because he didn't know that. A woman like her, Apache, young, alone, didn't end up in a river like that by chance. Either she'd run, or someone had tried to erase her. And if they were still looking, they might come this way. Thorn went outside to tend to the horse. He needed space to think. He tossed a saddle blanket over the fence to dry and looked back at the cabin. The door was closed. Smoke rose steady from the chimney. She hadn't moved. Inside, Sana had eased herself upright with effort. Her body ached from cold and bruises, but it was the silence in the cabin that struck her most. Not threatening, just still. His coat smelled of smoke and leather. She pulled it closer around herself and looked at the chair where he'd sat all night. She wasn't used to being looked after. Not like that. When Thorn returned with water and jerky, he found her sitting up, trying to smooth the dress over her legs. It was still damp and damaged, the neckline hanging too low, but she made no move to cover herself further. There was no shame in her face, just calm, unreadable dignity. He handed her the cup of water. She drank in slow sips, watching him. "Where's your family?" he asked carefully. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked down, then away. Her fingers tightened around the cup. Her jaw tensed. "All right," he said after a beat. "No rush." She finished the water and handed the cup back, nodding once in thanks. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the rest of the day, they spoke little. She didn't have much English, and he didn't know a word of Apache. But communication found its way in glances, gestures, the way he cleared a space for her by the fire, and how she folded the blanket before lying back down. Thorne spent the afternoon repairing the broken fence post, but his mind never left the cabin. He was no stranger to bad luck showing up on his land. But this felt different. This wasn't a drunk ranch hand or a lost traveler. This was a woman someone had let drown. And she'd lived. When he returned that evening, the fire was still going. She was asleep, curled beneath the blanket, his coat still around her shoulders. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her, trying to figure out what the hell to do next. She hadn't told him what happened, but she would, in time. And until then, she wasn't going anywhere. Neither was he. The morning came slow and gray. Fog sat low along the tree line, and the cabin was filled with the scent of wood smoke and damp wool. Thorne stirred the embers until the fire caught again, then stood and stretched, his back tight from another night in the chair. Sana was still asleep, but her breathing was even, her color better. Her ankle remained wrapped, resting atop a folded blanket. He moved carefully, trying not to wake her, but her eyes opened anyway. She didn't startle, just blinked up at him in silence, her face still unreadable. He nodded once, a silent, "Good morning," and she returned the gesture. He poured water from the kettle into a tin cup and set it on the edge of the bed beside her. Then he stepped away, giving her space. She took the cup with both hands, drank slowly, and when she was done, she looked at him, eyes steady, watchful. "You need food," he said simply, already turning toward the small pantry by the hearth. She nodded. He spooned beans into a tin bowl, tore off half a square of cornbread he'd baked 3 days ago, and handed both to her without fuss. She didn't thank him, not out loud, but the way she accepted it, careful, slow, like she hadn't been offered something of her own in a long time, was enough. After eating, she moved to sit up straighter, trying to swing her legs over the edge of the bed. She winced. The ankle was stiff. Thorne crossed the room before she could try to stand and motioned for her to stay put. "You're not walking yet," he said, kneeling to re-wrap the cloth around her ankle. She tensed, but didn't pull away as his hands worked. Her legs were strong, skin bronze, and bruised in places. He noticed the raw scrapes on her knees and shins, probably from the rocks near the riverbank. Someone hadn't just let her fall in. She'd been chased, maybe thrown. He didn't ask, yet, but the idea left his jaw clenched as he rose. He didn't need to know everything right away, but he needed to know if someone was going to come looking. "Anyone coming after you?" he asked, keeping his voice level. She didn't look at him. Her gaze dropped to the floor. Then, after a long silence, she shook her head. "Once. Firm. Family," he pressed. "Tribe." Another pause. She lifted her chin. "No." Her voice was clearer today, though her accent was strong. He didn't question her further. He believed her, but he didn't believe she'd told him the whole truth. Not yet. That was fine. He wasn't the type to force talk. Instead, he handed her one of his old flannel shirts. "Your dress needs mending." She took the shirt with both hands, looked it over, then at him. The coat had slipped down her shoulder during the night, and with the fire warming the room, she hadn't fixed it. The torn neckline of her dress hung open again, and Thorne caught a glimpse of the soft curve of her chest. He looked away immediately, stepped back, and gave her privacy without a word. She changed behind the quilt he hung from the rafters. When she stepped out, her hair was braided loosely over one shoulder, and the shirt swallowed her frame, sleeves rolled to her elbows. The hem hung just below her thighs. Her legs were bare. She walked with a limp, but didn't complain. She pointed at the hearth broom and motioned to the floor. He frowned. You don't need to do that. She nodded anyway and limped toward the broom. He didn't stop her. For the next hour, she moved slowly around the cabin, sweeping, folding blankets, tending the fire. Thorne watched without interfering. She wasn't being polite. She was claiming a role, no different than how someone set their tools down to work the land. It wasn't about obedience. It was about presence. Later, he saddled his horse and headed out to check the cattle near the North Ridge. He left her with fresh water, the fire strong, and the rifle within reach. Not because he feared her using it, but because she might need it if someone else showed. The ride gave him time to think. The river didn't explain everything. She hadn't come from upstream. He would have seen signs of that. And she hadn't wandered in from the east either. The nearest camp was 2 days' ride, and there'd been no word of Apache movement in the area for weeks. That meant she'd come from closer, from someone trying to keep her hidden, or get rid of her. He returned before dusk, a squirrel in his satchel, and found her outside, seated on the porch, one leg propped on a stool, hands working slowly to mend her torn dress. She looked up as he approached, eyes unreadable, needles still between her fingers. You shouldn't be out here on that leg, he said, unslinging the satchel. She nodded, didn't move. He sat beside her, handed her a strip of dried meat. She took it wordlessly. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It had shape to it now. Familiar. Tired. He broke it after a while. You're staying here until you can walk right. She nodded again. And after that, she didn't answer. But she didn't look away, either. That night, she didn't sleep right away. She sat in his chair, near the fire, her legs curled under her, still wearing his shirt. Thorne cleaned the rifle at the table. Neither spoke. When she finally stood, she paused by the bed and looked at him. Then she lay down. He waited until her breathing slowed, until he was sure she was asleep. Then he let himself breathe, too. He didn't know her full story, but she was here now, and that was enough for today. The fourth morning came colder than the others. A thin layer of frost coated the porch rail, and the smoke from the chimney rose in a steady line into the pale sky. Thorne stood at the woodpile behind the cabin, axe in hand, splitting logs in slow rhythm. He was careful with his footing. The ground was slick with ice, and his bad knee didn't allow for wasted movement. He didn't glance back at the cabin, but his mind stayed fixed on the woman inside. Sana had spoken little since the day she arrived, but she was watching everything. The way he moved, the way he avoided her eyes when her dress slipped down her shoulder, the way he never asked the hard questions out loud. He brought the wood in just after sunup. She was already up, kneeling at the hearth, stoking the fire with practiced hands. The dress she'd mended lay folded on the table. She wore his shirt still, sleeves rolled to her elbows, collar loose, the bottom brushing the tops of her thighs. Her bare legs were tucked beneath her as she worked, ankles still bandaged. Thorne placed the wood beside the stove and hesitated. You sleep all right? She looked up not at once. Yes. It was the first full word she'd spoken in a day and a half. You warm enough? She glanced at the coat draped over the bed, then back to the fire. Yes. He nodded, turned toward the door, and paused again. I'm heading to the creek. Check the snare lines. Be back in an hour. I come. He turned to face her. She was already shifting, reaching for the folded dress on the table. Her ankle wasn't ready, but she didn't want to sit idle. He could see it on her face. She needed motion. He gave a slow shake of his head. You're not walking that far yet. She looked down, disappointed but not upset. He softened his voice a touch. Soon. She didn't argue, just nodded again, quieter this time. He left without another word. The sun had climbed a little higher by the time he returned. He brought back 2 rabbits, cleaned and ready. He stepped into the cabin, expecting to find her by the fire, but she wasn't there. His heart kicked once in his chest. He set the rabbits down fast, glanced to the empty bed, then turned toward the door. She was outside, sitting on the porch step, one leg stretched out, the other bent, wrapped in a blanket. The sun hit her hair, turning the black strands a muted chestnut near the ends. Her face was calm, but her hands were clenched in her lap. When she heard him step onto the porch, she turned slightly, not startled, just aware. You should have waited, he said, but without sharpness. She looked down, needed air. He studied her for a long second, then sat beside her. The porch creaked under his weight. I'm not keeping you here, he said quietly, watching the tree line. She didn't respond right away. He added, You're free to go when you want. I don't expect anything from you. Her hands loosened. I know, she said. Her voice was soft but certain. I stay. For now. He accepted that without nodding. He didn't want to press for what for now meant. After a long stretch of silence, she asked, You have people? He hesitated. No one had asked him that in years. I did, he said. Wife. Daughter. She turned to face him slightly. They died. Fever. 8 winters ago. She didn't speak, just lowered her gaze. You? He asked. Sana took a slow breath, eyes fixed on the dirt path beyond the porch. I was promised. To a man from another band. I said no. Thorne said nothing, letting the words settle. My uncle said I shamed him, that I bring a curse. Her mouth tightened. Her next words were clipped. They tied my hands, left me near the river. The quiet after that was long. Thorne's jaw tensed, but he didn't speak. I swam, or tried. You would have died, he said simply. She looked at him. I know. He didn't tell her what he thought about the kind of man who'd do that to his own blood. He didn't say she didn't deserve it. She already knew that. What mattered now was she had survived. Back inside, she limped to the table and began cleaning the rabbits with a small knife he'd left out. Her movements were careful, practiced. He watched from the doorway, surprised. You done that before? She glanced up. Many times. He didn't say more, just handed her a rag to wipe her hands. When dinner was cooked, they sat across from each other in silence, the fire casting soft light across the room. After they ate, he stepped out again to bring in more wood. When he returned, she was sitting in his chair, one leg tucked up beneath her, eyes closed but not asleep. The flannel shirt had slipped down one shoulder, exposing her collarbone and the faint line of her chest. The firelight made her skin glow. She wasn't trying to tempt him. She wasn't trying anything at all. She just was. He looked away quickly, grabbed a blanket, and draped it around her without a word. She didn't open her eyes, but her hand reached up slowly and held the edge of the blanket in place, right where he'd left it. That night, she didn't return to the bed right away. She stayed in the chair until he climbed in and turned his back to the room. Then he heard her move quietly across the floor. A rustle. The mattress shifted. She lay down behind him, not touching but close. He felt the warmth of her body through the blankets. She said nothing. Neither did he. But neither of them had to, and neither of them would leave. Not yet. The sun hadn't yet cleared the canyon rim when Thorne opened his eyes. The room was quiet except for the low pop of the fire's last embers and the soft rhythm of Sana's breathing behind him. She hadn't moved during the night. Her presence remained steady and close. Her body hadn't touched his, but he could feel the warmth of her, the faint rise and fall of her breath under the covers they now shared. He didn't turn to look at her, just lay still for a while, thinking. It had been a long time since he'd shared a bed with anyone, not since his wife. And even then, the warmth of a body beside his had never carried the strange weight this did. Not obligation, not desire alone, but something closer to responsibility. She was not his. He knew that, but she was here. And the longer she stayed, the more it mattered what kind of man he chose to be around her. When he finally sat up, she stirred too. Her eyes opened, still heavy with sleep, and met his without surprise. She didn't pull the blanket up or turn away. Her long black hair had spread across the pillow, slightly tangled. One shoulder peeked from beneath the shirt collar that had slid down in the night. He spoke first. You sleep all right? She nodded once. Yes. She didn't look ashamed, or expect him to be. He stood slowly, reaching for his trousers folded near the chair. I'll make coffee. Outside, the wind had died down, and the sky was a pale wash of color. He stepped out to fetch water from the barrel, boots crunching against frozen dirt. As he worked, his mind kept drifting back to the bed, to her, lying there like she'd always belonged in that space. No ceremony, no question, just quiet acceptance. Back inside, she'd already moved to the hearth and was adding fresh kindling to the coals. The bandage on her ankle was loose. He crouched beside her, reached for it, and she extended her leg without being asked. He unwrapped it gently, checked the swelling, still tender but going down. Her skin was smooth under his fingers and warm. He caught himself staring, just for a second. "Should heal fine," he said, voice low. She looked at him, eyes steady. "I work today. You don't have to. I want to." There was no room for argument in her tone. He didn't push it. She spent the morning helping him inside the cabin, washing the tin bowls, folding blankets, sweeping the corners of the room where dust always crept in. Her limp was lighter now, though she still favored the foot. She moved with quiet purpose, never asking for instruction. She didn't hover or fidget. She simply did what needed doing, the way someone who'd lived a hard life learned to. Later, while Thorne was outside repairing a cracked post on the chicken pen, he caught her in the corner of his eye. She'd stepped out with the broom, standing barefoot on the porch, slowly brushing dust off the wooden planks. The shirt she wore had been cinched with a strip of deerskin at her waist, shaping it to her curves. The skirt of it lifted slightly with the breeze, revealing the strong lines of her thighs. She didn't seem to notice or care that he was watching. He looked away before she looked up. When she came back in, she returned to the fire and took a seat on the floor, legs tucked under her, and began sorting dried herbs he kept in a small pouch. She motioned to his shelf, asking permission to use one of the old stone jars. He nodded. She ground the dried leaves between her fingers, sniffed once, then added a pinch of another root. "What's that?" he asked. "Chamomile. With sumac." "For what?" "Pain. Your leg." He paused. "You noticed that?" She glanced up, not smiling. "You move stiff when cold." He nodded slowly. "You make tea. I'll drink it." She poured hot water over the mixture, stirred it with the handle of a spoon, and handed him the cup. Her fingers brushed his. He didn't say it out loud, but the tea helped. That night, after the fire had burned down to low light, she changed into her mended dress again. It still bore the torn neckline, but she hadn't sewn it shut. When she crossed the room to the bed, Thorne stood from the chair and met her there. He hesitated, hand halfway to her arm. "You sure?" he asked, his voice gravel low. Her answer wasn't in words. She stepped closer, slid her fingers around his wrist, and brought his hand to the small of her back. Her eyes were clear, her touch soft. She stood on her good foot, close now, and leaned her forehead gently against his chest. Thorne closed his eyes. They lay down together, neither hurried nor unsure. He undressed her slowly, carefully, like she might fade if he moved too quick. She didn't flinch or tremble. Her skin was warm beneath his hands, her body curved and soft and full. She reached for his shirt buttons without needing permission. He kissed her, not hard, not rushed, just enough to feel her lips part under his. She made a quiet sound in her throat, almost a breath, and pulled him closer. There were no words that night, no questions, no promises, only staying. And that was enough for them both. The morning after, neither of them spoke about the night before. Not because there was shame or confusion, but because it didn't need to be said. They had crossed a line together, not out of desperation, but something quieter and heavier. A decision neither of them could explain aloud. Thorne woke first, turned toward her slowly in the dawn light filtering through the cracks in the wall. Sana was on her side, facing him, hair splayed across the pillow, one hand resting lightly against his chest. He studied her face for a moment, strong brow, high cheekbones, a faint scratch on her jaw from the river, still healing. Her expression was calm, eyes still closed. She was not a girl who belonged to anyone. She was not lost. She was here. He eased himself out of bed without waking her and pulled on his trousers in the low light, moving stiffly to avoid putting weight on the bad knee too quickly. The pain was worse in the mornings now, but he didn't complain. He never had. There wasn't anyone to complain to before. He stepped outside into the cold. The air bit at his skin and cleared his head. He chopped firewood for a while, slower than usual, not because he was sore, but because he couldn't stop thinking. Not just about what they'd done, but what it meant. She wasn't some lost traveler anymore. She had a place now, in his bed, in his home, in his life, whether he was ready for it or not. When he came back in, she was awake, sitting by the fire, hair pulled back, his shirt draped over her shoulders. Her dress lay folded nearby. She looked up at him, met his eyes fully, and didn't turn away. That was new. He poured water into the kettle. "You all right?" She nodded. "Yes." He waited, but she didn't say more. She didn't need to. He handed her a slice of bread and jerky. She ate quietly, then asked, "You have work today?" "Always," he said, setting down his cup. "That east fence still leaning. I'll need to brace it before the next snow. I come with you." He raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" She nodded. "I help now." That was her way. No drama. No request for permission. Just a statement of fact. She dressed slowly, testing her ankle. The swelling had gone down. She wrapped it tight again and put on her moccasins. The deerskin dress hugged her curves as it had before, torn slightly at the neckline, but clean, mended where it needed to be. The torn section still revealed the top of her cleavage, and though Thorne noticed, he didn't let his eyes linger. They rode out together on his horse, her behind him, arms wrapped gently around his waist. She rested her cheek against his back for a while as the wind passed them by, and he felt something settle in him he hadn't felt in years. Something like peace. Not happiness exactly, but stillness. Grounded. At the fence line, she handed him tools, held nails between her fingers, braced posts when he hammered. They didn't talk much, but they worked in rhythm. When he stumbled once, grunting from the strain in his leg, she was already there with a hand on his arm, steadying him. "You should sit." "I'm fine." She looked at him like she didn't believe him, but didn't press. As they rested under a tree for lunch, she watched a hawk circle overhead. "Why you live alone?" she asked suddenly. He didn't answer right away. Then, "Because I was afraid to care again." She turned to him slowly. "Still afraid?" He didn't lie. "Less than I was." She reached out and took his hand, held it there in silence. On the ride back, he asked her something that had been weighing on him since the beginning. "Why didn't you try to run?" She was quiet a moment. Then, "You didn't treat me like I was nothing." That answer struck deeper than anything else could have. He nodded once, said nothing. There was nothing to say. That night, after the chores were done and the dishes cleaned, they sat by the fire. She braided her hair in the chair while he read from a faded book he hadn't touched in months. The silence between them felt fuller now, less guarded. When she finished her braid, she stood, walked to him, and sat in his lap without hesitation. His hands found her waist naturally. She leaned her head into his neck, her voice low. "Someone come for me." He tightened his grip around her without meaning to. "They'd have to go through me." She nodded, satisfied. They went to bed early, but not to sleep right away. She undressed slowly this time, standing beside the bed in the firelight. He sat on the edge, watching her. When she reached for his hand and pulled him up, he followed. No rush, no uncertainty. They made love again that night, slow, deliberate, warm with the kind of closeness that didn't ask questions. After, she curled into his side, one hand on his chest. "Tomorrow," she asked, "we do it all again." She smiled softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Good." He kissed the top of her head and stared at the ceiling until the fire dimmed. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like home. Snow came overnight, quiet and heavy. It wasn't deep yet, just enough to cover the ground in white and soften the world outside the cabin. But Thorne felt the change before he even opened his eyes. The cold had settled into his knee, stiff and dull, like it always did when weather shifted. He reached across the bed instinctively and found her there, still curled close, her arm resting across his ribs, her skin warm beneath the blanket. He lay there a while, eyes on the ceiling, listening to the faint crackle of the fire and the wind brushing against the walls. He hadn't heard her speak in her sleep, hadn't felt her shift. She slept deeply beside him now, as if this place truly belonged to her, as if she belonged here. By the time he got up, she was already stirring. She reached for his shirt and pulled it on before sitting at the edge of the bed to braid her hair. The firelight lit the side of her face, calm and unreadable like always. She didn't speak. Neither did he. He stepped outside with a mug of hot water and watched the snow fall soft through the trees. The fence lines would hold for now. The cattle were fed. The cabin was stocked for winter. They'd survived just fine. But as he stood there, something in the wind shifted, a sound out of place. Hooves. More than one. He stiffened and stepped off the porch, hand drifting instinctively toward the rifle propped inside the door. Before he could turn back, Sana appeared behind him, already holding it out. They locked eyes. She had heard it too. In the distance, 6 riders appeared from the line of trees. No guns drawn, no panic, just a slow, steady approach. Apache. Thorn narrowed his eyes, but didn't reach for his weapon. He stood his ground. Sana came to stand beside him on the porch, wrapped in her deerskin dress and his coat, her chin lifted, eyes unwavering. Her fingers touched his arm briefly. Not fear, just readiness. The horses stopped 20 yards out. The riders sat quiet until an older man dismounted. He wore layered robes with a sash of red and white feathers. His face was worn with age, skin like dry stone, eyes dark and knowing. He spoke in Apache first, slow and formal. Sana responded in the same rhythm, her tone respectful but even. Thorn didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The old man's voice was calm, not hostile. Then the man looked to Thorn and switched to English, his accent heavy but precise. You pulled her from the river. You took her in. She lives because of you. Thorn said nothing. In our law, that means she belongs to you. Thorn's jaw tensed. I don't own her. The elder nodded, as if expecting the answer. Not own, not hold, but protect. Make family. That is what it means. Sana stepped forward, her face unreadable. She turned to Thorn, placing her hand lightly on his arm. They mean, you're her husband now, if you want. She didn't sound embarrassed. She didn't sound uncertain. Thorn's eyes flicked from her to the elder, then back again. He thought of the river, the first night, the silence they shared, her sleeping beside him without fear, her hands on his chest, her voice asking tomorrow. He nodded once. No grand words, just a steady look into her eyes. The elder bowed his head. The others followed. Then, without ceremony, they turned their horses and rode back the way they came. No demands, no warnings. Sana remained beside him. She didn't speak until the riders had vanished from view. They came to see if I was safe. You are, he said. She nodded slowly. I know now. Inside, she removed his coat, hung it by the door, and sat by the fire with her legs tucked beneath her. Her dress, low at the neckline, shifted slightly as she reached forward to stir the embers. Thorn watched her for a long moment before kneeling beside her. They think you belong to me, he said. She looked up, meeting his gaze. Do you? He exhaled. I think we belong to each other. For the first time, she smiled. Small, real. That night, there was no hesitation. She undressed before him slowly, not shy, not rushed. He followed, pulling her gently to the bed. They moved together like they'd done it 100 times, but this time felt different, heavier. Sure, like whatever had started in that river had settled into something they both understood now. Afterward, she rested her head on his chest again. Her hand splayed flat over his ribs, her fingers warm. I don't go back, she whispered. You don't have to, he said. She closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. Snow kept falling outside, and inside, nothing moved. Nothing needed to. The days that followed moved in rhythm, quiet, steady, with the kind of routine Thorn hadn't known in years. The snow deepened, but didn't trap them. It wrapped the world in stillness, gave the land the silence it seemed to ask for. And in that stillness, something between them settled. Not just comfort, not just intimacy, but permanence. Sana had taken to moving easily through the cabin, her ankle nearly healed, her steps sure. She no longer asked permission for things. She simply did. Folded clothes, prepared meals, stitched up his old shirts with needle and thread she found tucked behind the spice jars. She organized shelves that had been cluttered for years. She made space for herself without ever speaking of it. One morning, Thorn found her standing outside barefoot in the snow, head tilted to the sky, eyes closed. Steam rose off her cup. The flannel shirt she wore beneath her deerskin dress clung to her form, the fabric worn soft against her curves. Her breath moved in slow rhythm. She didn't flinch at the cold. You're going to lose a toe, he said from the doorway, voice low. She opened her eyes and turned slightly, smirking just enough to be seen. "It's not cold," she said. He stepped outside, tossed a blanket across her shoulders. "You're not used to this kind of winter." She leaned into him. "No, but here doesn't feel cold." He looked at her, quiet for a moment. "You miss them? Your people?" Her face softened. She looked out over the trees. "Not them, just the parts that weren't cruel." He nodded. "You got a place here, if you want it." "I already took it," she said, without hesitation. Inside, Thorne had been preparing for the deeper part of winter, patching the roof where snow would pile, reinforcing the door hinges, checking the root cellar. Sana joined him in these tasks without being asked. She didn't hover, but she didn't avoid the hard work either. One afternoon, while they sat together in silence peeling root vegetables, she looked at him suddenly and asked, "Your wife. What was her name?" He paused. The knife in his hand slowed. "Claire. She was kind." He nodded. "Too kind for this world." She watched his face carefully. "And your daughter?" "Ruth. She was 5. Got sick after the fever, took her mother. I was out hunting. Came back to find them both buried." Sana set the knife down gently, reached across the table, and rested her hand on his. "I don't ask to replace them," she said. "Only to stay." He looked at her, really looked. She wasn't asking for anything more than what she'd already given. Presence, labor, warmth, quiet understanding. He didn't need more. "That's all I want," he said. That night, they sat by the fire, his back against the wall, her legs draped over his lap as she leaned into him with a book in her hands, one of the few he owned. She couldn't read English fluently, but she ran her fingers over the words, asking for meanings now and then. He answered with soft, single-word replies. At one point, she traced a word with her fingertip. "Family," she said aloud. She looked up. "What is family to you?" Thorne didn't answer right away. His hand rested lightly on her leg. "Someone who stays. Someone who sees you and doesn't turn away." Sana nodded. "That is what I thought too." Later that night, while he was trimming the wick of the lantern, she stood by the bed and slowly untied the leather sash around her waist. The deerskin dress slipped from her shoulders and pooled at her feet. She stepped toward him, fully bare, unflinching. "You still look away?" she asked quietly. He didn't. Not this time. He crossed the room, pulled her into his arms, and held her there without rush. She smelled of ash and pine and skin warmed by firelight. He ran his hand along her back, her curves soft and familiar now. She pressed her mouth to his, not asking, just taking what had already been offered. They made love again, slower than before, as if it wasn't just about need anymore, but claiming each other, the home, the right to be alive and together. Afterward, she lay stretched across the bed, breathing steady, skin glowing in the fire's reflection. Thorne watched her from beside the hearth where he stirred the last embers down to coals. "What if they come again?" she asked. "They won't. But if they do?" He looked over his shoulder. "Then I'll still be here. Same as now." She said nothing, just reached for the blanket, pulled it around herself, and patted the space beside her. He crossed the room, climbed in, and pulled her close. Outside, snow began falling again, thicker now, but they didn't notice. Inside, nothing changed, because they were no longer waiting for what came next. They had arrived. By the time spring arrived, the snow had thinned into patches across the land, retreating under the sun's slow return. The cabin no longer groaned beneath the cold night. Shoots of green pushed through the thawing dirt along the fence line, and the river, once a brutal force that had nearly taken Sana's life, now ran slower and clearer, its rage cooled by the changing season. Thorne stood at the edge of the field with his hands on his hips, eyes scanning the garden rows he'd started turning over with a spade. His coat was off, shirt sleeves rolled, sweat at his temples. His knees still stiffened some mornings, but the pain no longer kept him in. He didn't limp as heavily anymore. It helped that Sana walked beside him now, barefoot in the dirt, dress hitched at the knees, hair pulled into a loose braid, her body full and strong against the pale morning light. They had made it through the winter together, through silence, through labor, through everything neither of them had spoken out loud, but had lived in full. Nothing about it had been easy, but nothing had broken them. Sana was kneeling in the dirt, her hand resting low across her belly as she planted squash seeds in a shallow trench. Her breathing was calm, her pace unhurried. The way her palm lingered over herself each time she moved was new, but he'd noticed it for days. Thorn stepped toward her slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, and crouched nearby. She didn't look up right away, just kept pressing the seeds gently into the soil. "You been feeling all right?" he asked, watching her hands. She nodded once, then finally looked up. "Yes." He studied her face for a moment, then her hand on her stomach. "You know already?" She met his eyes, calm. "I know." He nodded, not out of surprise, but out of understanding. She didn't speak it as news. She said it as a fact, a continuation of everything they had chosen together since that first cold morning in his bed. They worked until the sun reached the midpoint of the sky. Then they walked back to the cabin side by side, her arms slipping into his without a word. She leaned against him as they passed the porch, and he wrapped his arm around her waist. Not for show, not for steadiness, just because he wanted her near. Inside, she stirred the pot over the hearth while he poured water into the basin and washed his face. The small space that had once felt empty now felt full, quiet in the right ways, warm in the ways that mattered. Her moccasins rested by the door next to his boots. Her shawl hung beside his coat. A second cup on the table. A second pillow on the bed. That evening, they sat out front together, the sky turning orange over the ridge. A hawk moved slow above the trees. The breeze was mild, lifting the ends of her braid. He turned to her. "You still think about leaving?" She didn't answer right away. "Then, no. I thought I would." "I don't." He nodded, then added, "If you ever do, you don't need my say-so." She looked at him, her eyes soft but firm. "I don't want to belong to any law. Not your people's. Not mine. You don't." Her voice was quiet. "But I choose this." He reached for her hand and held it gently in his own. "I do too." It was not a proposal, not a performance. Just truth, spoken simply. Later that night, they stood in the garden again under the moonlight, the soft earth cool under their feet. She turned to him and placed his hand back on her belly. "You'll teach him cattle?" she asked. "If he wants to learn," Thorne said. Then added, "If it's a girl, she'll ride better than both of us." She laughed quietly. It was the first time he'd heard it like that, free without pain behind it. They went back inside, where the fire had already burned low. The room was dark, but familiar. The bed was theirs. The silence between them wasn't empty. As she settled into the blankets, her back pressed to his chest, Thorne looked out toward the door, listening to the wind move through the trees. He thought of the first time he'd seen her, half drowned, broken and cold. Now she was warm, full alive, growing life inside her, and staying. Not because she had to, because she chose to. And so did he. There was no more question of who she belonged to. She belonged here. So did he. And that was the end of it.